All right. Name is Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined by Deep State Kuba, who has given me his deep state word of honor that he didn't puncture my tire last night.
Or if I did, it was for the greater good.
Okay, fair enough. It's the look. I've just spent the week arguing about Kissinger. I understand about chessboards and all that. So
It was either this or depose the government of Paraguay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, I guess this relatively minor inconvenience was not a big deal. I like that. Yeah, I like. By the way, some chat comments about it. Managed to both under and overestimate my personal finances. There's a so it got. I thought Ben did his part from either his or some friend's home who could afford to rent studio space, and Ben is paid by the CIA. Now,
although the CIA may just not be paying you a living wage, that's you can square that circle pretty easily.
I suppose. Yeah. Although honestly, if there were more space in the actual home, I might not have to rent studio space. But in any case, yep. So we are going to, at long last, be watching Piers Morgan's conversation with Bassem Youssef, as we've been kind of referring to, we were originally going to do this last night, but I got a flat tire on my way to aforementioned studio, and so we had to reschedule it for tonight, but we did not want to miss it entirely. This is the last breakdown of 2023 before the show goes on hiatus for a few weeks. But you're the one who suggested this. You want to set us up a little bit here? I think probably Piers Morgan might be a little bit more of a known quantity to viewers, but certainly on the Bassem Youssef part.
Yes. Well, Bassem Youssef is an Egyptian-American comedian. He emigrated relatively recently, and he describes part of his journey at the beginning of the show, and I thought that I could condense that and we could skip ahead. He worked as a surgeon in Cairo before the Arab Spring. It was during the Arab Spring, when he was treating people in Tahrir Square, that he began broadcasting these Daily Show style takes on the news, like peak Daily Show, I guess. He gets compared to Jon Stewart, not Trevor Noah. And that led to a series in Egypt, which eventually got canceled with prejudice. And he ended up in the US. He does comedy in Arabic as well as English. He has a very devoted Arabic language fan base. And because he came over relatively recently and the climate had changed, he's curbed a lot less. He's assimilated a lot less than previous generations of Arab Americans. And he, as a strong public advocate of Palestine, his wife is Palestinian, occasionally would get invited on shows to discuss it. He appeared on Piers Morgan's program. And Piers Morgan is a very conventional transatlantic media lib. He's a bit more obnoxious than the standard, and gets on bizarre tirades about Meghan Markle or Kim Kardashian or whatever cultural outrage du jour. But his positions on issues, economic, political, international, tends to be very Clintonian, let's say. And what's been interesting is seeing how his mind has really been opened by the conflict and the recent eruption of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because not to say that he's switched into a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or anything, but his show has been notable in bucking the trend of being a safe space for Israeli talking points and inviting Palestinian guests, allowing them to say their piece, disagreeing in a civil way when he feels it's appropriate. And he has his strange media litmus tests. For instance, everyone needs to condemn Hamas, but the
Oh my God, I can't believe we let the stream go this far without that. Kuba, do you condemn Hamas? Oh shit, it's not going to happen.
I mean, what does condemn even mean?
Okay, all right. Stream's over, guys. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. It's condemning Hamas is actually kind of the boomer lib unceded land recognition, right? A little virtue ritual that you can open any meeting or interview with. In any case, while he still has that perspective, what's remarkable is that he's willing to listen to the other side, and it creates an opportunity for what we're about to watch, which is actually a civil and reasoned discussion about the Palestinian-Israeli issue between people who hold very different views and very different sympathies. And as much as I know that you have an ideological position, I have an ideological position, I think we're both, I guess in the parlance of the internet, cucked libs enough to still want to appreciate the value of civil disagreement, especially on an issue this contentious and this closely tied to people's identitarian reflexes when it comes to political events. So I thought that modeling a grown-up disagreement and explaining how and where both sides give a little and stand their ground would be a valuable exercise, as much as dissecting the arguments in a more conventional debate.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I have, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm in a slightly odd relationship to the terms of all of that, since you know, on the one hand, I am definitely a polite conversation cuck, but on the other hand, I am officially legally anti-Semitic, as of the congressional resolution that was passed this week. So I suppose that's a combination that doesn't really win with anybody.
One of the interesting things about Piers Morgan's evolution towards more moderate position and willing to listen to the Palestinian case is it really shows how much further so much of the establishment has gone in terms of not just uncritical support of Israel, but also the repression of dissenting views.
Yeah. I think there actually has been a pretty remarkable shift in that we've seen, certainly at some point between 2014 and present, right? Because when, it wasn't as bad as what's going on right now, but when, a version that was still quite bad, right, of this was happening in 2014, when Israel was bombing Gaza, then, and if, Israel's bombed Gaza, a million times since 2014, but the last major sustained
Palestinian Groundhog Days to see if it sticks its head out in March, because if not, then that's 3 more weeks of Israeli bombing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But this is, but yeah, so when that was happening, right. I mean, that was, there was certainly, it would have been unimaginable for there to be members of Congress who were denouncing it. It would have been unimaginable for somebody like our friend Norman Finkelstein to sort of make the kind of tour of major media that he's made, arguing with people about it. I mean, it just the question wouldn't even arise, right? Nobody would be like, hey, why don't we book Norm, for this one, because that would just not be seen as a perspective that your Chris Cuomo's or Piers Morgan's would feel the need to humor in the slightest, right? So for whatever reason, and some of that is because of just how bad it is this time, just how much more severe it is than the previous times. But I also think it predates that, because I mean, I think you already saw a lot of this shift, like before we saw just exactly how bad this was going to get.
I also think that it has to do with the abandonment under Benjamin Netanyahu of an Israeli pretense towards seeking a universal accommodation, which would take the interests of Palestinians into account in any way, shape, or form. Right. And it could be argued that was always the kind of crypto-Israeli plan or position. But it could also be argued that there was, even under Ariel Sharon, a much greater appetite to strike a deal, even if it was entirely pragmatic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some pretty hard limits to that. If certainly if you go back and look at the, really at this point, almost unimaginably kind of conciliatory, days of, Ehud Barak or Ehud Olmert, that if you look at the details of kind of the most that they were ever willing to contemplate, right? Like the most, was pretty far short of even, like it's at least very questionable whether the most they were ever willing to contemplate would have added up to anything like a viable and meaningfully independent Palestinian state. And you could certainly point out that, settlement building, continued, on the West Bank, throughout all this period. So, they were trying to, there was not only an effort to sort of make it something that would be very different from what people are sort of typically imagining when they think in the abstract of like, okay, Israel withdraws to something like the pre-1967 borders, and, and there's like a real Palestinian state, in the territory they've just withdrawn from. But, and I think that's true, and I think that's important, but also, look, if they'd gotten, Arafat or Abbas in 1999, 2000, or 2007 to go along with, what was, I think, rightly critiqued as basically a proposal for a pretty miserable set of, Bantustans, separated by Israeli settlement blocks and Israeli roads and all, like some kind of presence in those settlement blocks and roads of the Israeli army, etc. If they had gone along with that, they would have been happy to do that, right? And certain, and that certainly is a substantive shift, right, from the Netanyahu attitude. And
the Netanyahu attitude is a maximalist and unapologetically so.
Yeah, well, and the unapologeticness, right, is I think just as important as the substance. That it's certainly not just that substantively they're like no longer willing to make even those concessions, but that rhetorically, there's just no pretense anymore. That the people, that it's, I mean, and like this is something you see a lot that there's this incredible mismatch between the rhetoric coming from the actual Israeli government and the rhetoric coming from Israel's defenders in the West, right? That's like, oh, well, of course, if only there wasn't all this damn Arab rejectionism, love a two-state solution, Netanyahu talking to a security cabinet, knowing that there are cameras present, says, nope, no two-state solution, not ever. There's all this discussion of, like say, oh, well, they're trying to be super duper careful. What can you do? Human shields. And, Netanyahu says, yes, we're fighting Amalek, the ceremonial head of state denies that there are any innocent civilians in Gaza, etc. So I think the sort of dropping of the pretense, right? In other words, like even apart from the substantive change, just, having a Israeli head of state who sounds less like, some NATO official justifying, justifying the cluster bombing of, Belgrade, and more like a Serbian official justifying, what was going on in Bosnia or Kosovo. I think that opens up some space in the West. I mean, what that ultimately does is a different question, but it at least changes the terms under which the discussion happens.
Well, also, up until quite recently, certainly when I was in college and when I was in graduate school, one of the tropes that you'd get from defenders of Israel was that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, status of women, the place where even Muslim Arab Israelis have more freedom than they would elsewhere, than they would in comparable states, whether Syria or Iraq. Or they never bring up Jordan as a bad case, interestingly enough, but they stress only democracy in the Middle East. But since some of the Netanyahu reforms, for instance, officially enshrining Judaic identity for the country, that has been significantly degraded in terms of the rhetorical arsenal of the defenders of Israel.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, like, you go back and watch a while ago, we watched Alan Dershowitz's debates in the early 2000s with Norm and with Noam Chomsky. And I remember in one of those, he made a big deal about how Israel has this wonderful independent, Supreme Court, to protect human rights. And of course, that's kind of, I think that rhetorical tool is no longer going to be in the arsenal, due to Netanyahu's court reforms and the, and the real, which it's kind of hard to imagine that, how recently there were like hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews in the streets protesting that. And yeah, I mean, I think in general, as you say, the stuff like the nation state law, make it, no, this is a state for Israeli Jews, not for anybody else, certainly makes it much harder to say that. It's also, it was always a strange argument because if, because it's like leaning that hard on the status of Arab citizens of Israel. It's like, okay, though, right? You clearly don't want to extend that status to all of the Arabs from, as they say, the river to the sea, right? That would be anti-Zionism, which is, legally anti-Semitic. So what exactly is the point here insofar as it justifies the things that are the most controversial, which are the status of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians? But real quick, and then we should get started.
Well, I think it was more important as an alibi that would allow Westerners to justify an uncritically pro-Israeli position without having to acknowledge that it was based on tribal identitarian lines.
Yeah, that seems right. All right. So I think this is queued up to start around where
the olive oil.
Yes. So let's see.
And everybody's like, why are those people reacting like this? because they don't see what the other person sees. And I hope in that interview that we can bridge that gap.
Yes. No,
Before we can I
Yes.
show? Okay, so this is a gift from me and my wife. This is olive oil from the West Bank.
Huh?
Power
Whenever
Move
I
by
go to
Bassem
a lot,
Youssef.
my wife also
He
said,
brought a gift.
ask
Piers Morgan
for
did
the
not.
oil from the West Bank.
It's very good.
It is the best oil ever. And the thing is, the olive trees, they survive up to 600 years.
Mhm.
And they are
I thought
passed one generation to the
he
other.
was queuing
And
up
it is like a family
a
heritage.
callback to discuss when Israeli settlers burn the olive groves in the West Bank. And I think he may have been planning for that, but
He just got
if you're waiting for it, it doesn't come. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough.
And the way that you do it, so this is za'atar. Za'atar is basically thyme, and you add to it sesame and a bunch of herbs. And the way that you eat that, you take like a piece of bread. We don't have to do it now, maybe at the end of the interview.
Yeah.
And you soak it a little bit in the oil, and then you take the za'atar. And I'll demonstrate here. And then here.
I love it. Well, I love Arabic food. So
You're
at the end of the interview,
you're leaving with this oil. So
I
it's
will
yours.
take that.
It
And-
shows that.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. And it's very kind of your wife. Thank you.
No.
Thank you very much for me.
Well, I'm the one who bought it, but it's okay.
Obviously, you started the last interview with, I mean, I would argue savagely dark humor involving your wife.
Mhm.
How you've been trying to kill her and she was using your kids as human shields and stuff. And I'll be honest
And I'm
with
still
you.
trying to. But you know what? When I failed, you know what I did?
Mm.
I went out to the house and I just like randomly slapped other neighbors.
So, it's interesting.
By mistake.
Now, this time I'm ready for you, okay? This time I'm ready for the humor.
Oh, you're ready? Okay.
No, but it's interesting because last time I was very taken aback. And I remember thinking, as you were doing this right off the top, I remember feeling very uncomfortable, unusually uncomfortable, and thinking I didn't know how to react to that. I didn't know whether I was supposed to laugh or be silent, and I sort of ended up sort of slightly grimacing, half laugh and listening. And then I realized it was very powerful what you were doing. It was satirical, but it was savagely satirical and extremely effective. And that's why I think the interview did so well. But I'm not going to pretend that I found it easy to listen to it or to react to it, because I didn't.
You know why? Because all I did was just take the talking points that's been in the media, not just for after October 7th, all through the conflict. It's always like, we need to kill it. All right. You need to kill 5? No, kill 10. You need to kill some? No, kill all. This is what satire does. It take reality, flip it on its head, exaggerate it, and then you can see how sometimes very uncomfortable and even sometimes stupid that sounds. Because I was just reacting to whatever the media is telling me. It's like, oh yeah, okay, do it. There's no pushback. So suddenly, the person who's proposing the most extreme measures is like, oh, we'll take it. Oh no, that's too much. So that was like a very simple technique. I just took the talking point and just exaggerated.
It was devastatingly effective. I thought. First, before we go any further, how is your wife's family? Because she is half Palestinian.
Yeah.
Are they okay?
They're good. They're good. They are safe for
now. Pierce deploying a power move, demonstrating sincere concern, or credibly stimulating sincere concern for Bassem's family. Score is tied now.
You know, I saw you tweet at the IDF. It's like, how can they know?
You know how many views that tweet's at? Nearly 40 million.
Yeah.
Me just saying, how are they going to see this message if you've cut the internet off?
Yeah. I'm wondering if the IDF's like, why aren't the Palestinians liking my tweet? Because they don't see it.
Right. No, but I thought that was a perfectly correct assessment of it.
Yeah.
But the reaction to that tweet I did was enormous, as everything is in this thing. And I had a lot of people say, finally, Piers, you get it, right? Finally, you get it. And I wanted to say, listen, I'm trying to reach a place where I get this, but it's an incredibly complicated issue for someone who is not Arabic or Jewish to poke their head into. And I've had to cover it as a journalist for a long, long time. I think I said to you before that I was editor of a Daily Mirror in England when we opposed the Iraq War, for example. So, you know, I have taken stands on this thing. On this one, I find, I'm going to be completely straight with you. I discussed this with Jordan Peterson this week. And he did a pretty incendiary tweet in which he said, "Give them hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough." And he was actually very self-reflective about that in the interview we did this week, where he later issued a 20-minute video because he said sometimes a one-line tweet can be unnecessarily inflammatory to people. Much better to take time to explain it. Here's where I've got to with this conflict now. I viewed what happened on October the 7th as an absolutely appalling atrocity, a terror attack of unimaginable horror. And I absolutely think that Israel has a right to defend itself from the people who committed it, Hamas. And I've questioned for the last 3-4 weeks, what is a proportionate response? And I have said repeatedly, I don't know the answer. I want people who have a view to have a view about that. And I'll ask you again about where you think we are with this. I also acknowledge that Hamas live amongst civilian population in Gaza. And therefore, if you do what the Israelis are currently doing, which is a ground offensive into Gaza, a lot of civilians are going to get killed. And at what point does that become disproportionate or even illegal? And I don't know the answers to those questions. And I have a moral quandary because my instinct is to say that Israel has no choice but to respond to what happened in a very forceful manner. I understand why they want to eliminate Hamas altogether. I understand that if they feel they can, then perhaps we can move to a two-state solution or peace or whatever it may be, although I don't think that Netanyahu will ever be the person to do that. But the moral question for me is, at what point does this become disproportionate? And when you see thousands of children being killed in Gaza, it fills me with utter horror. And then people say, well, do you condemn it? And I find it very easy to condemn Israel turning off the water, Israel turning off the power. I think it's ridiculous that Israel should have that power over millions of people who are not part of their country. I think it's terrible what's happening in the West Bank with the settlers. I think that the stuff there is completely easy to condemn. But can I, hand on heart, condemn Israel trying to destroy Hamas after what they did on October the 7th? That is where I'm struggling to find myself saying I condemn it, because I believe that they are right to try and destroy Hamas. Now, what do you feel about my moral quandary?
Well, there's a lot of points, very lot, and I think this will kind of like lay the ground rules for that interview. There is a whole thing about like, is it right to defend itself, the condemnation. First of all, let's start with condemnation.
Yes.
You want my opinion?
Yes.
Condemning Hamas or condemning Israel?
Yes.
Completely useless. Completely useless.
Why?
I condemn Hamas.
God bless you,
Israel.
Bassem Youssef.
What happened? Nothing. It is just checkpoint, like morality checkpoints.
So I've interviewed a lot of pro-Palestinians, for example, some of whom will immediately say, I unreservedly condemn the terror attacks of October the 7th, and then go on to criticize Israel. And I think that's it's a position I can completely respect.
Yeah.
But I find it much harder to respect a pro-Palestinian guest on my show if they simply resolutely refuse to say that they can condemn the terror attacks.
Yes.
I find that less worthy of respect.
But you see, this is the problem with the news. We go into the circular motion of the same answer. One thing that I have noticed, not just on the coverage of these events, the events before and before and before, every time this starts, people say, we don't know what's happening. It's a very complicated situation.
Right.
What is happening now? And for me, as a viewer, if a conflict that's been there for 75 years and the media with all this technology has been covering it, and we hear the same exact words, we don't know what's happening. It's complicated. It's a very complex. That is a failure of the media apparatus. That is the failure to themselves and for the audience, because why every time this happens, it seems like it is happening from point zero. And I think to help understand that, I will get to the October 7th. I will get to the condemnation. I will get to the self-defense. But I think maybe we can we have like all the time in the world, and we can discuss, this interview could be a bookmark, landmark for maybe looking at that conflict in a deeper way that nobody had gone there before. We have the views, we have people waiting.
Yes.
You know, as I said, I'm the least qualified to discuss that, but it's an opportunity to use it.
I'm not massively well qualified myself.
Yeah, both of us. Like,
I'm
look at us.
I'm an Irish Catholic.
I mean,
right?
look at us. Yeah, two privileged people. One white, one white, white wannabe, discussing the most complex conflict of our history. But I want to start in a totally different area. I want to start with anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I think it's an important issue.
Yes.
I think there is a rise of anti-Semitism in the world, and I think there is this is very dangerous. And I, as a Muslim who has been through events where there were terrorist attacks somewhere, and that reflects to us on us, I completely feel that. Since what happened, I had text message from the Jewish friends. Are you okay? Are wife's family okay? And I was texting them, are you okay? And I think it is very important to agree on the language, because the word anti-Semite has been used and abused, and most of the time not for the good interest of the Jewish people. Because the first 2 days of the coverage, I watched the news, and there was a lot of protest that was led by Jewish Voice for Peace, and they were led by people who opposed the Israeli attack on the civilians. And I remember quite well, many of the Republican representatives in Congress came out and they were calling these the global intifada, the global jihad. I love it when they say jihad. They sound like a horse. Jihad. It's very funny. Or they say, like, these are, and I quote, Iranian-backed jihadists. And I said, wait a minute, but most of those people are Jewish. Those people who took over the Capitol, the same people who took over Central Station in New York, which is known as the biggest civil disobedience event in America in the last 2 decades, they were all Jewish. And then I find Nikki Haley saying anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And then I remember, it's like, oh, Jewish people in America are saddened by the fact that they are not citizens of America or citizens of the world, but they are citizens of Israel, and they have to back Israel in whatever they do. And these are not my words; these are the words of Jon Stewart. He went down and he said, it's very, very important to divide these two. And what is very, very interesting.
Would you compare that on that specific point to the way that people try and say all Palestinians are responsible and accountable for what Hamas do?
Yes, yeah.
In other words, I think you can be very critical of Israeli government and their policies and Benjamin Netanyahu and the politicians, but that doesn't mean that you have to take that criticism to innocent Israelis who may have exactly the same criticism themselves.
And this is why it is very important to have these kind of discussions. Because
yeah, no, just wanted to pause on this part. So I assume they're going to get back to the condemning Hamas and all of that stuff, talking about October 7th at some point later in the conversation.
Oh, yes, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll maybe wait on that for then, but on the stuff about anti-Semitism. So I have an article that came out this morning about this in Jacobin. It's the Congress is absolutely wrong to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. There was a time when Jacobin used to have article headlines that were sort of more interesting and evocative than that, but now search engine optimization has taken everything over, and they all just sort of state exactly what the thesis of the article is. But in any case, that's but get into some of the strangeness of this equation, like even beyond the sort of left-wing critique of Zionism that I would certainly sign on to. Like it's just a strange thing, because Zionism is a very specific political ideology that lots of people disagree with for lots of reasons. In fact, Jerry Nadler, not any kind of leftist, pointed out during the debate about this resolution that, and I start out the piece talking about this, that one of the odd consequences of this is that tens of thousands of the most ostentatiously ultra-religious Jews in New York are now, officially considered to be anti-Semites by the American Congress because they're anti-Zionist, for religious fundamentalist
Old
reasons.
country reasons.
Yeah, exactly, right. And but there is, so obviously for most of this, I'm sort of laying out what I see as the correct critique of Zionism, but I think some of what the Piers Bassem conversation is in effect getting into here is that there's this very strange and sort of unhealthy thing that happens where if you kind of equate Jewish people generally with the state of Israel and Zionism, but you're all in favor of all of the above, that's good and approved, right?
Viktor Orban, great friend of Jews.
Yeah, right. It's the and it does seem to me there's a certain having it both ways, where it's like, well, what's being where it's a horrible and anti-Semitic thing to equate Jewish people generally with the state of Israel and Zionism if you don't like it, right? If you do like it, right, then go nuts.
Exactly.
Right? Equate away.
Exactly.
In fact, equating is encouraged.
Implying that Jewish Americans have a dual allegiance to the United States and Israel as an argument for greater surveillance of Jewish scientists or members of the intelligence community. Absolutely out of bounds, just gross Nazi stuff. Saying that Jewish Americans have an obligation of dual allegiance to Israel, because exactly, that is entirely praiseworthy and indicates that you're completely on the right side of the Jewish question.
Yeah, all the time, right? That second one, both of those are simultaneous by stated by the same people every day, right? And it does look, as somebody who would prefer it for all sorts of reasons, selfish and otherwise, if people didn't equate Jewish people generally with a bad thing, with something they regarded as a bad thing, but also sort of more principled intellectual reasons.
In a lot of ways,
this seems like maybe not a good idea to encourage the equation, just as long as everybody is putting the pluses and minuses on the right parts. I mean, this is a little bit like the point I've heard, that I remember you making in the past with regards to certain kinds of social justice liberalism, that in the long run, it might not be the best, the best idea pragmatically to encourage white people to spend this much time thinking about the importance of whiteness.
Absolutely. And I think that in some ways, non-Zionist Jews in the West are the human shields of the Likudnik types, right? They want to turn an Israeli conflict into a pan-Jewish conflict, and they're actively trying to cultivate that impression. And it would be bad enough if it were just a project of convincing non-Zionist Jews that they should back Israel, but it's convincing Gentiles, particularly the most anti-Semitic elements among the Gentiles, that all Jewish people are on board with the Zionist project.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right, let's go back to Piers and Youssef.
Anti-Semite themselves. MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She said like, oh, I send my aides, and they took pictures of the protesters. Basically, she's surveilling protesters. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is very known for a very famous post in 2018 where she blamed the California fires on a Jewish space laser gun. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? And it's just like, oh, they were burned because Jewish investors, Rothschild and Finstein, anything that ends with Stein, because that's of course sounds Jewish. They put a satellite and shooting laser beams to
It's possible.
and not just her. You have Steve Skoulas. Thank you so much. He is now the Speaker of the House, and he has been invited before for an organization that was funded by David Duke, the founder of the KKK. You have Kevin McCarthy, who is the former minority speaker, leader of the Republican Party in the House, and he accused Jewish billionaires of rigging the midterm. So how come those people are accusing us of anti-Semites? So here's the thing. So let's go to the equation that Nikki Haley put on Twitter. Anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. No, it is true. People who hate Jews, they're also anti-Zionists. It is true. And you could be someone who hate Zionists, who don't like Zionism, and you are Semite. You could even be Jewish. And guess what? You could be a Zionist, like those people, supporting Israel, and at the same time you hate the Jews, because the chant "Jews will not replace us," these echoed in Charlottesville. It did not echo in Gaza. I mean, in Gaza they say worse stuff in between the bombing on their downtime. And these are the same people who are seen with Nick Fuentes, with Stephen Bannon, and you know what's most interesting?
Trump had him for dinner at Mar-a-Lago.
And all of those people are buddies with Benjamin Netanyahu. So how does this work? How does this work? And you know the people who speak against this, like Jon Stewart, like Bernie Sanders, like Naomi Klein, what do they call these people? What do they call them? Self-hating Jews. And you know what else now they call them? They call them capos. Capos. You know what's capos? Capos, basically these were the Jewish inmate in Auschwitz that were forced by the Nazis to stand as guards on their own inmates. You see how degrading this is. And this is the way to shut down conversation. Anti-Semite, Islamophobe, you hate America, you hate the military, you hate Egypt, war on Christmas. This is how you shut an environment that does not allow disagreement is not an environment made for growth. It's an environment made for control.
Let me ask you this. Say, take the student protests in America, at universities. I have no problem instinctively with students protesting. It's actually part of the DNA of being a student, right? But I do have a problem with two things. One, the protests that happened almost immediately after October the 7th, within hours, which were clearly, deeply, deliberately inflammatory and hurtful to Jewish people. Secondly, I have a real problem with the students who were beaming direct pro-Hamas slogans onto buildings on campuses in America. You know, I'm all for free speech, and I really am. The whole show is predicated on that. But not to the point where you see Jewish students barricaded into libraries because a mob is descending on them. There is a distinction to me between people who are obviously overtly, I mean, there was a professor at Cornell University who was literally seen in public shouting how exhilarated he felt by the attacks of October the 7th. He still hasn't been fired, that guy. I think that crosses a line. Do you?
Yeah, I do not like this way. I mean, I can understand why, but I don't condone it. I would never, because you have to understand these people, again, I'm not supporting them. I just want to make sure about two things. The reason that I started with anti-Semitism, because I wanted to make sure to clear any confusion that when I speak about Israel, I'm speaking about Israel.
Yes.
When I speak about Jewish people, I'm speaking about Jewish people.
Yes.
When I speak with my Zionists, I'm speaking about Zionists. It was very, because
I think it was very powerful that you did that.
Yeah, I have to be careful.
That's the first thing you did, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, but at the same time, when I tell you why does that happen, it doesn't mean that I condone it. There's a difference between explanation and justification. Those people who are exhilarated, the way that they see, this is the same reason why people were so happy about the interview. What do they see? They see Israel as a criminal state who is killing their people, and in the same time, they are supported by the international community and the America. They have no guns, they have no superpower backing them. All they have is just feeling of happiness, like, yes, our enemies that we cannot touch them has been hurt. All they can think about that these are their enemies that have been hurt, right? I'm not condoning this, but again, like when people were celebrating terrorist attacks, you know, against Western targets, of course I don't condone that. But why? Because those people has been from a very young age. What have they seen? They're not being heard by the media. the plight and the suffering of the brothers in Israel, in Palestine, in the Arab world are not being heard. People in Iraq, like when America and Britain invaded Iraq, right? What do the Arabs saw? It's like two superpowers are coming in on just regular people. So whenever there was like a bomb or like an attack on American troops, people would celebrate. Yeah, they're our enemies. Emotions are very inflammatory, and it is not right. But those people had nothing else. All they can is just like shout. All they say is like to rejoice. It is not right. Again, I'm explaining why is this happening, because it's like, yeah, if I cannot get you, I'm just gonna scratch your eyes. I'm gonna scratch your eyes because you've been beating me all the time, and you have the whole international community backing you up, and all I can do is scream. Is it right? No. But it is understandable. Again, it's not the right thing. But no, it's not like understandable. It's like, oh, no. But again, it is an explanation. Now, hate. And again, this is another way why this has been magnified in the media so much. What does the Western audience see? They see people rejoicing for the death of innocent civilians in Israel. This is what have the Arabs seen for years on the Arab world. For example,
Yeah. So I want to pause maybe for a minute on this whole thing that they just went through, because I think you have some thoughts about it, about sort of the because I want to talk about both the sort of substance of the distinction that Bassem is making, and I think what you were maybe getting into, which is like the rhetorical advisability of it, but because like I am because I am very sympathetic to his point here, because I'm very, and this is like partly that's a I just, it's just a judgment on the substance, and also partly, maybe this is just me being too much of a philosophy nerd, that like people not distinguishing between causation and moral justification drives me crazy, because those just seem like so obviously distinct concepts. And and I can remember, like, I don't know, whole thing gives me like traumatic flashbacks to like arguing with people after 9/11 and and all of that. But but I think your point here would be that it's like, okay, yeah, but like this might not be the best place to take the conversation.
So what I like about this particular interview is that despite the fact that the two parties belong to opposite camps, or there's enough daylight between their positions so they're not arguing the same side, they could very easily in this climate revert to the sort of crossfire template of reciprocal outrage. That's a very bad faith way to try to have a conversation, but it's a very effective way of creating media content. And if you introduce the idea that we want to understand the enemy, whoever we're bombing, somebody who has committed a terror attack against a sympathetic target, a criminal, you name it, then you always open up yourself to either a emotional overreaction leading to how could you justify what they did, or a bad faith tactical response, which would amount to the same. And then the conversation's over. And the other person, depending on how rhetorically fluent and dramatic they can be, can just win on performance. So if you're introducing this as a line of reasoning, you have to depend on the other party not doing that. You're vulnerable, but it's not always a bad move.
Yeah.
But it requires trust on the other side.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, that's a fair point, right? And I don't know. I mean, I guess on the one hand, it's Piers Morgan, who I have to say I've liked
Hard
him.
man to like.
Yeah, exactly, right. I've probably liked him more in this conversation than I have in other ones I can remember watching. But he always
It was
struck
like
me-
he was visited by Jacob Marley or something.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he got this he got this very specific there were 3 ghosts who came to tell him about calming down and listening to what people were saying.
I'm Walter Cronkite, and you, sir, are a disgrace.
Yes. But yeah, right. I mean, historically, he has come off to me as a bit of a blowhard, and so I can see that being a bad person to risk doing that with. But in this particular context, at least of course, anybody else can do whatever they want with the interview after it's over. But at least as far as this conversation goes, it seems like this might actually be okay.
Well, we'll see, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
If you look up Sidrot Cinema, this is in 2014 when Israel was bombing Gaza as usual, and the Israelis in the Sidrot, the kibbutz or the settlement, they went on a hill and they had popcorn and they had drinks and they were like watching the show and they were cheering with every rocket coming down. This is what we see. Western people didn't see that.
Well, somebody found a tweet actually of mine
Mm.
from 2014
Mm.
in which I said, at what point does what Israel is currently doing to the Palestinian people become terrorism?
Mm.
And because I've always said, I've spoken about this a lot over the years, and I've always tried to be extremely fair-minded, albeit nobody really wants you to be fair-minded. They want you to take a side. But that was clear that my thinking back then was that they were absolutely overstepping.
Absolutely,
mark.
absolutely. But again, to the point of rejoicing.
No, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
Is
but
it-
like if you, for example, Google the wedding of hate.
Mm.
This is like a Jewish wedding in Israel where they were celebrating the arsons and
No,
the
no, I've
burning
seen- I've
of
seen-
Palestinians.
Yeah,
But
Bassem, to be clear, I've seen lots of videos.
no, but like I'm not talking to you, Piers.
No, I know.
I'm talking to the Western audience
No, I
because
understand, but
I want to see I want to say this is what they see. I mean, for example, there is a very famous video for Samuel Abu Zaanin, who is like a young kid that he was shot point blank by an Israeli soldier, and he was not allowed to have any medical attention. And as his dead body was being put into the ambulance, the Jewish settlers were cheering. So for an Arab audience, this is what we see every day. So when they see, oh, we heard them back, we heard their people like they heard back, it is not right. But this is what hate does. It escalates. It feeds each other. Radicalism feeds it. It is terrible, and it is just like a vicious circle. So I would like to do something that is very interesting to me. I want, when I invited Jon Stewart to my show, as much of like a reception that if you've seen the YouTube, people just like
No, sorry.
we had to cut the 5-minute standing ovation for broadcast. People were on their feet for 5 minutes. They could not believe it. I remember Jon Stewart telling me I could never imagine that a Jewish guy from New Jersey would have that kind of reception in Cairo. And yet, on the internet, people who would have, what? You brought a Jew on your show? Why you are with a Jew? Yes, hate is there. Yes. So, and the thing is like why we do not see each other, people in the Middle East, people in the West, that we do not put ourselves in each other's shoes. And I want to do something very interesting today. I want to give, I like telling stories. And I'm going to tell you a very nice story.
Tell
and
away.
This is the story, surprise, surprise, of the suffering and the plight of the Jewish people. And I want to say that because it is very interesting when you see the trauma and the suffering that the people on the other side went through, you might understand why they're coming. So this is, see this? This is a map of all of the history of the expulsion of the Jews in Europe. They've been like, I have never seen a minority being kicked around this much, right? And of course, this comes back to the, the whole idea about the original sin, that you have betrayed Jesus Christ, the blood of Jesus is on your hands. And then comes the 11th century. At that time, Jewish people were not allowed to own land. They were just peasants. Even some of the professions were not even allowed to participate in. But they were allowed to do one thing, usury, money lending, because it was prohibited by the Catholic Church to engage into that. So what happens when you work in money? you get richer, right? And those Jews lived in ghettos. Now, ghettos was not just like isolated neighborhoods in cities. Sometimes ghettos were outside the city. This is like how isolated they were. And in those ghettos, they have to pay gold to the mayor or the governor or the prince or the noble. So they would see, you're getting richer. I need more taxes. So they pay tax. What happens when you have a business and they increase your rent? You increase your service, increase the taxes, increase the... So what happened? What the Christians started to default. And suddenly the image of the greedy Jew was created. Shylock, merchant of Venice. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. You know, like never did I see a creature like, you know, I can't remember that. Never did I saw like a creature that looked like a man so keen and greedy. Confound of a man. You know, English. I messed it up. Anyways, but this was the image, greedy Jew, the greedy Jew. This was created because of their conditions, and it became worse in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the first crusade to go and save the birth of Jesus from the unbelievers Muslim. And you know, this crusade did not kill a single Muslim. You know how many people they killed? 2,000 Jews. Because it's like, wait, the non-believers are all over there. Why? So they went to the...
All right. If online political discourse has told me one thing, it's when you start off by saying that you're just a comedian, you're legally obligated to say just the most incoherent, angry, poorly researched shit that anybody has ever heard. Bassem is breaking the rules. He knows too much. I don't know. Doesn't seem okay.
It's called the Crusades of the Rhineland. So they went to the Jewish community because, hey, we own the money, so let's kill them better than paying them. And then came the plague. And then all of the things like, oh, they're killing babies, who would do that to a baby, you know? And they accused them of poisoning the well. This was the kind of oppression that the Jewish people went through. Fast forward 19th century, there was like the Eastern Jew in Ukraine and Russia, and there was the Western Jews in Europe. Those people in the Eastern Jews had to immigrate because of pogroms, and they were like, you know, kicked out. And at a certain point, the people in the West, especially in England, it's like, there are too many Jews. We need a solution. The solution for what? For the Jewish problem. So it's like, we need to get rid of them. And you know what? Palestine was not even in the A list. Palestine was in the B list, because England proposed 6,000 square miles in Uganda for the Jews, 1903. And the reason why Palestine was not on the list, that it was objected by a lot of rabbis that said, like, it's a promised land, but only when the Messiah comes. But there were other options: Argentina, South Africa, Uganda, Madagascar. And eventually they said, all right, let's do Palestine. So they went to Palestine in 1914. There was 700,000 people living in Palestine, 3% were Jewish. 1917, Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour, he called the Jewish people in England that they are alien and hostile race. And the thing is, the only Jewish member of the parliament, of the English parliament, Lord Montenegro, he objects, said, like, these are British citizens, we should not kick them out. So they pushed them, but it was not going fast enough. Came the Nazis. And then it was not about the solution anymore. It was the end losing, the final solution by Hitler, because he needed an answer for the Jewish question, die Judefrage. And then, as you see, the Holocaust happened, the most orchestrated, industrialized, horrible genocide in our modern time. 6 million Jews died. So it accelerated, and they went. First of all, they left Eastern Europe, and they went to West Europe, and they went to America, and they were turned down, and they were pushed towards Palestine. So by 1948, right before the declaration of the State of Israel, there were 2 million people living there. Only 30% of them was Jews. So the whole idea of like a land without a people to a people without a land was a marketing thing. They were already Palestinians. So suddenly, from our perspective, the Jewish problem is not a Jewish problem, is not a Middle Eastern problem, is not an Arab problem. It is a European problem. It was pushed on us together with the guilt, because now we are the anti-Semite. Now we are the Jewish hater. And not just that, they took land. So people look at this like, why are we even, we had a lot of refugees coming in. And during that, there was a lot of, as you know, Zionist militia, the Aragon, the Haganah, all of these people were killing Palestinians. The famous massacre of Deir Yassin. You're talking about the atrocities of October 7th. It's horrible. But in the Arab mind, there is Deir Yassin, where there is an incredible movie called Tantoura, Tantoura, where the Israeli members of those militias, they talk about the atrocity that they did, including opening up the pregnant women bellies and having bets if the boy inside is a boy or a girl. It is one of the most horrific, and they talk about it. Some talk about with regret, and some talk about with pleasure. We did that, right? So you have even King David. I think your Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, was there. And if I was British, I would question this. Because as you know, King David was bombed by the Aragon militias. 91 British soldiers died. I don't know, if I was British, how come my Prime Minister would have the nerve to stay in that hotel? I mean, the ghost of the 91 British soldiers, that must be haunting for them. You see? So when you see all of that, and you see that suddenly, overnight, 1948, there were 1.5 million Palestinians. Half of them, 3/4 of them, were overnight pushed into refugees.
Yeah.
And this is why it's called the Nakba, the catastrophe. So now we have all of this building up into the minds, and suddenly this was like a conflict, a hate, a problem that we didn't have to do anything with. This was basically pushed on us by the Europeans. You see, this is why it is important to say that. And I'm not saying that just like, oh, let's wipe out the state of Israel, let's like push them in the sea. No, but it's important when you talk about the conflict that you talk about the root causes, right? No, there was like a vibrant Palestinian culture happening over there. And right now they are erasing this culture. Suddenly I'm thinking of like Israeli feta cheese, Israeli hummus. Oh, that's an insult. Israeli hummus. Come on. I mean, take the land, but leave the hummus, man. I mean, come on. I mean, that's not fair. You are someone who's always spoken against culture, cancel culture. Right now, a whole culture is canceled.
This may actually be the first thing he said that I disagree with. I think Israeli hummus is fine. Nobody, nobody owns. Look, there are a lot of forms of appropriation that are very literal and bad going on over there. The cultural appropriation of the hummus, I cannot find myself to find it within myself to get upset about. Oh, you're muted, Kuba.
I have trouble believing that he has any real outrage over that. It's more like you've taken everything else. Can't you please just leave us the hummus? It's like, no, we will also take the hummus. The hummus is ours. It has always been ours. This is Judean and Samarian hummus.
Yeah, I see Bad Lefty in the chat making the inevitable joke here. Have to condemn hummus. Yeah. I mean, I suppose to probably take a flippant point more seriously than it deserves to be, right? I do actually think the sort of mixing and melding of cultures is like the one positive side effect of global imperialism. But obviously, it's done in a better and healthier way without that. But in any case, let's keep going.
Let me ask you this. Jonathan Friedland is a top Jewish journalist for the Guardian newspaper. He wrote a very interesting column last week in which he said, at the root of all this, you could argue you have two sets of people with just cause, and they believe passionately in their just cause. And he was sort of advising people not to take sides unless you really understand the history. Would you agree with that? Would you agree that both sides have legitimate just cause? Not with the methodology that's taken place, and you've given an extremely detailed analysis of the build-up to what happened in 48. To me, it's pretty clear 700, 800,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, and it should never have happened. And that has been absolutely, I think, the root cause for so much resentment. But can you, at the heart of this debate, agree with Jonathan that you could argue there's just cause on both sides?
There's
behind all
there
this?
is a cause on both sides, but I'm walking on a tightrope here because
Yeah.
I'm not a Palestinian.
Yeah.
But from the Palestinian point of view, there's a lot of people. I mean, there are 2.2 million people living in Gaza. There are 3.5 million people living in the West Bank. There is 350,000 people living in East Jerusalem, and there is like 6 or 7 million people living outside. Those people, the Palestinians that were pushed out, they do not have the right to go back. Right now, if you meet Palestinians, you'll see them wearing a necklace with a key. That key is their house that they were kicked out from in Yafa and Haifa. You know, like my wife's family comes from Ramla, which is 50 miles from Gaza, and according to the law, those people have absolutely no right to go back. Even if you are a Palestinian with an American passport, they give you hell in order to go in. And yet, a Jewish person born anywhere in the world, born in Poland, born in the Ukraine, no question asked, he can jump on a plane, land in Israel, and get the Israeli citizen and take a house that most probably belonged to a Palestinian. So it is not just like it is an ongoing injustice that has been happening. Now, I mean,
Where would you criticize, if you're being fair-minded, where would you criticize from 48 onwards the behavior of the Arab side?
well, put yourself in the Arab side. At 1948, you constituted 70% of the population. Suddenly, the UN is giving you 48% of the land, right? Not just that. I mean, the Arab regimes, because they did terribly. And see, this is the thing. Like, Arab nationalism at the height of these people feed on each other, you know, because it's very, very important to have a problem. Oh, it's Israel, and for Israel, oh, it's the Palestinian. It's a very good distraction. I mean, sometimes I feel that like the Palestinian cause is very useful for both sides to stay there as attention because it's always a way to reflect. But and this is a very important question because in the mind of the Western audience, they always thought of the Palestinian resistance or the Palestinian side as like Islamic, as militant. No, as a matter of fact, some of the early suicide bombers were female Christian Palestinians because they, like the RIA, you know, they were fighting for a land. The whole idea of Islamization of the whole cause came very later. As a matter of fact, you will find this very interesting because when I saw this, I did not believe it. This, you know, the Fatah movement, which is the PLO, the Fatah. This was their slogan. Can you see? You see there's a crescent, a cross, and a menorah. And they say unitary, democratic, non-sectarian. So basically in the 1960s, Fatah were basically marijuana smoking tree hugger hippies. And yet that didn't work, right? And the thing is, I always hear that like Arabs were giving for so many chances for peace. That is not true. As a matter of fact, all along history, Israel didn't give an inch of land by peace. 1973 war, they gave back Sinai because Egypt like initiated the war. 2006, they went out of south of Lebanon because of the resistance they have. Even the disengagement of Gaza, they didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart because they had too much casualties. And even the Oslo Accords, the peace treaty, the one that Isaac Rabin and got the Nobel Prize, they did it because of the Intifada. So what is the message that Israel is giving to the Arabs? I will never give you anything with peaceful resolution. You will always have to fight for it.
Do you not think that, for example, I mean, Bill Clinton feels this very strongly, that there was a great deal to be done, and Arafat, just in the end, having indicated the whole time that if we got to this place, there would be a deal, just walked away. That was the closest that everybody came, and that actually, I mean, could Clinton have done any more than he tried to do then?
I'm not, again, that's why it's very important to have people who are much more qualified than me to talk about this. But two things I can say about that. Number one, the whole thing about the Oslo Accord, there was a video for Netanyahu who was talking to the settlement offer 2001, and he was bragging about sabotaging. He was talking to us like, I sabotage it, like there was going to be no peace. Yeah, you've seen that, right? Yeah. And in that video, if you remember, when he was saying like you have to hit them hard, 2001, no Hamas at the time. They were talking about the Palestinian Authority. We have to hit them, we have to kill them, we have to make them feel the pain. And then one of them says like Bibi, But wouldn't America kind of just like, so what? The American public is easily manipulated. 80% are with us. It is absurd. And as a new American, where I can have the privilege of being retrospectively angry, I said, like, this guy is mocking the government who is, and the people who have been with him all the time. It's like, oh, they can be easily manipulated. They can do, and even, by the way, even Isaac Rabin, the one who actually did the peace accord, he was known famously, said the way to actually beat those children is to break their bones, called the broken bones policy. They will like get those kids and break their bones on the pavement. So this has the whole idea about like Israel wanted peace and Arabs only wanted to fight is a very, very bad
I actually
representation.
think as it's gone on, the genuine will on both sides for peace has not existed.
No,
I think it's been a deceit to the world
no, I'm sorry.
and to the relative groups of people on both sides.
The official,
And actually a betrayal of it.
the official stand of the Palestinian Authority, and again, I cannot speak, I mean, it is very difficult to do this. The official stand of the Palestinian Authority is that we are just happy with 22% of the land. Just give us like that. Yes, there are people that dissent, but the thing is, you cannot just say, okay, let's talk about peace. And then you take away my land. Let's talk about peace. And there's a kind of like passive aggressiveness happening. Oh, let's talk about it, but I'm going to build settlements. I'm going to suffocate your cities and your villages.
You see, I think that has been incredibly inflammatory.
Yes.
Worsening the situation. I think putting back the chance of peace. I mean, Netanyahu, I interviewed Netanyahu earlier this year.
Yeah, before we get to whatever Piers discussed with Bibi, do want to get into that a little bit because, you know, as you pointed out in the chat, I mean, it is absolutely true that the virtue of this interview is that, you know, even though he throws out some, you know, very dumb media lib framing here, he is also willing to let the answer be no and listen to the explanation of the no instead of just steamrolling and, you know, insisting right on the framing, right, which is great. I will say that you know, that this is like this whole section here, right? I mean, I think even Bassem and I think rightly trying to push back on some of this was kind of accepting the framing of the question, which I think conflates a bunch of different things that should be disaggregated, since you know, when you talk about, use these phrases like, you know, the sides, or sometimes I heard the Arab side and sometimes I heard Palestinians, and you know, these are all different things. I mean, certainly anything between you know, between 1948, when, you know, the Israel's War of Independence was fought between Israel and certainly not any sort of Palestinian force, but various surrounding Arab states. But at least in that case, there was like an Arab High Council, you know, that was within the area that, you know, that like actually had a chance to weigh in on it with opinions about things before the war started. But certainly in the subsequent 40 years till Madrid in 1988, when you talk about, you know, any sort of diplomatic wranglings, you know, who's willing to accept what or whatever, you're not really talking about, you know, like there are no Palestinians with seats at any of these tables. You know, you're talking about the relationship, and, you know, the relationship between diplomacy, between wars, between Israel and various Arab states, right? So it's as bad as it is, as much as I'll complain sometimes about people talking about, and, you know, I'll complain about people with various ideologies and various agendas acting as if there's a Palestinian hive mind, and anybody who's a Palestinian is part of some collective entity that's made decisions to do this or that. Like in this case, it's like, what, there's like an Arab hive mind, like everybody in, you know, like not just Palestinians, but just like all of the countries where Arabic is the, you know, is the language, are sort of grand collective entity here. You know, that makes even less sense.
Well, it's there's also the confusion of Arab and Muslim, which and Bassem is absolutely right to point out that the PLO early on was a cross-sectarian organization, and there was historically a significant Christian population in Palestine. There isn't anymore for a bunch of different reasons. But there was at the beginning of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that was part of what led to this kind of secular nationalist appeal on the part of the PLO. And the obviously what Piers Morgan, I think, mentally has trouble breaking out of his media lib frame. He reminds me a little in this debate of Joe Rogan talking to a smart person and recognizing that there's something he's not getting, but still having the confidence to ask the questions and, trot out what he's heard from other people. And Piers Morgan doesn't recognize fundamentally that he has a double standard for Israel and for Palestine. And he doesn't recognize that, like you said, the other side isn't a hive mind, that the attribution of the Intifada or the Hamas attacks to the Palestinian people as a whole is fanciful. And I think that to maybe take a step back and make it a bit of a smarter observation, one of the realities of the Palestinian situation is that they've had to speed run nation building.
Right. At
the beginning, these were Arab-speaking provinces, vilayets of the Ottoman Empire. Then for 20, 30 years, they're provinces of the British Empire. There aren't really any representative bodies or any civic institutions that could forge a Palestinian civic identity. All that there is the opposition between Jewish Israelis or Jewish proto-Israelis, Jewish Zionists, and the non-Jewish, the Gentile, Arab-speaking population. That population is forced to develop a political consciousness and a national identity because of that conflict. Without the instigating spark of Israeli independence and occupation by the state of Israel, maybe Palestinians would have formed a single state with Jordanians. Maybe there'd be a different arrangement. Maybe it would be micro cantons. Maybe it would be another Lebanon. We don't know. But from a pre-national or proto-national population of Arab-speaking imperial subjects to what is now a self-conscious national group, that was forced on the Palestinian population through the most horrific circumstances. And every attempt failed, whether it was the PLO and a secular Arab nationalism, whether it was trusting in the neighboring Arab states in a kind of pan-Arab solidarity, whether it was Islamic resistance, whether it was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or left socialist Palestinian resistance. Every movement has failed. And what you end up with is a horribly compromised Fatah that is essentially administering an occupation in a very uneasy partnership with Israel in the West Bank, trying to, and I think that many Fatah cadres are trying to do the best that they can in an impossible situation. You know, save those that can be saved, water down Israeli repression, delay, drag your feet, give where you must, and sneak where you can. Or Hamas, who are brutally repressive against the captive population in Gaza. It's those who are not enthusiastic cadres do not have a comfortable time living there. Certainly have no avenue for expressing their preferences.
Yeah, if you think of Gaza, you know, with the sort of comparisons that are often used, and I think justifiably used, right, as a kind of open air prison camp, you know, can extend the metaphor a little bit and say that it's not unlike a prison that's run by a very unpleasant prison gang.
Yeah, it can be both, right? Like, and in fact, these sorts of circumstances rarely bring out the best in people.
Right.
Don't forget that apart from the reality of violent repression and the smothering of what we call human rights, there's also the extreme material privation that was true well before the bombing started because of the Israeli siege. And those conditions, when you have to struggle for the most basic resources, especially in a population which is overwhelmingly young, is going to lead to bullying, hoarding, all kinds of personal aggression that will get rolled up into organizations, but also is just a fact of life that everyone encounters, and everyone has to, you know, simultaneously deal with the trauma of what they see and be strong enough to survive into the next day.
Yeah. So yeah, and I mean, I think this is really, like, you know, in some ways it circles back to the original point, because you know, even when we sort of drop the like real absurdity of sort of using the classic framing, there's Israel, there's something called the Arabs, which is like, you know, the Egyptian dictatorship, the Saudi royal family, you know, this like vast collective entity composed of lots of people who don't like each other, and also sort of including the Palestinians, but not really them. That even if we drop that, right, and just talk about, you know, the sides where we're talking about the Palestinians, it's still a misleading way to talk, because you're talking about a nation state and a bunch of stuff other than a nation state. So you're talking about a nation state on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, you're talking about, you know, Fatah / the Palestinian Authority / the PLO, etc., which is there's a sort of complicated org chart, but is all basically the same thing in effect, which is, you know, despite the fact that it's been pursuing this strategy for the last you know, I don't know, 15 years or so, where it kind of goes around the world collecting diplomatic recognition as an independent state, right? It's nothing like an independent state. It's essentially a, you know, in effect, it's a subcontractor for the Israeli military that is allowed some extremely limited autonomy in parts of the West Bank that can be and is routinely taken away. And because of that, because it's not unreasonably seen as, you know, collaborators, you know, with the Israeli occupation, by much of the Palestinian population, you know, doesn't have a lot of, you know, that the support is a lot less deep than it used to be, etc.
Well, that's an accusation that also gets made about Hamas, because as the administrators of Gaza, they had a certain claim under the Oslo Accords to transfer payments from Israel to run security, provide services, you name it. It's a pittance.
Right.
But under conditions of such extreme poverty, it's something.
Right.
And it was Netanyahu who greenlit the transfers. So
yeah, famously arguing to members of the Likud party at the conference that that it would be foolish not to do so because Hamas Hamas needs to be kept alive in order to continue to divide the Palestinians between West Bank and Gaza and slow down possible momentum for Palestinian statehood. But in the case of Hamas, there's something that's up until the beginning of October, in certain ways exercised more autonomy, although also could certainly provide people with less meaningful defense. It's
the difference between a prison that's administered by a prison gang and a prison that is administered by, at gunpoint, a council of senior convicts.
Right. Yeah. So all of these things are very different from a Palestinian state. It's not like there's a Israeli state and a Palestinian state having a conflict. That there's the Israeli state, and then there's a complicated patchwork of resistance and collaboration to the Israeli state, and
which is one reason why this is also maddening for the Israelis, because they would prefer to have a single point of contact when they want something done on the Palestinian side. If they could do that, if they had a pet king, a dictator, then it would be easier to manage the dispossession of the Palestinian people, because you would have an organized, capable puppet to work through.
Right.
Now, what they're seeing is, even when they try to establish a pet Palestinian administration, the level of hostility and resistance among the population is so great that you'll have spontaneously organized resistance, often episodic, no bigger agenda behind it, just people snapping, rock throwing, occasional other types of violent or aggressive outbursts, sometimes peaceful protests. For instance, the right of return, the March of Return, the Gaza flotilla. Those were attempts to militate for stronger Palestine, some kind of recognition, and they were both brutally repressed. And even with all of that, you can't stop some kind of Palestinian resistance from forming, even with all the technology that they had around the wall. You can't prevent that force from hurting you.
Yeah.
So Plan B apparently is not accommodation. Plan B is some light genocide.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, that there's it is a little bit complicated, because I would not, my preference would be to just, let it go without saying that, that people who, could hardly be more different from us ideologically committed atrocities are, bad. And to just focus on more politically salient issues. There is a certain tendency on the left, I think, that comes out of deep powerlessness and frustration to sort of identify with anybody anywhere who's sort of doing something that that spites your enemies, and you do see these weird arguments that people will talk about stuff like October 7th, and they'll bring up they'll bring up things like the Great March of Return, and I think it becomes really important to disaggregate which argument you're having with who, right? In other words, if you're arguing with the lib who says, oh, if only the Palestinians did nonviolent resistance, they would have like, we'd have like a 2-state solution by now, then I think if you're arguing with them, bringing up the Great March of Return makes perfect sense. Say, hey, this was tried and it did not have the effects that you predicted, right? It was brutally repressed, and by and large, the world accepted the repression.
And where were you when it happened?
Yes, exactly, right? And these are all really good points. Now, if you're using that as a sort of justification, not you, Kuba, but, they have the generic you, right?
The gray zone guys.
Yes, are using that as a justification for, massacring a bunch of, random Israeli grandmothers waiting at a bus stop, very unlucky Thai guest workers, who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like all of the atrocities that happened on October 7th. Then in addition to the sort of, moral argument that I would certainly make against that, I think intentionally, I think killing civilians is really bad, which is a principle, by the way, that I think it was a really bad idea to give up on just before we needed it to object to the U.S. funded Israeli bombing of Gaza. But beyond the moral argument, it's also like, well, hold on. If you're going to try to justify these things by bringing up stuff like the Great March of Return and say, oh, look, we tried the nonviolent way and that didn't work. Well, hold up. What does didn't work mean here? Because you're right. It was brutally repressed by Israel, massive deaths, etc., bloodthirsty repression. But also, like, that 80% of the population of Gaza wasn't driven from their homes by Israeli repression of the Great March of Return, right? There wasn't anything like it didn't, like, if we're going to say because thousands of marchers were killed and obviously the occupation persisted, that therefore it was a failure, that is nothing like, I mean, we're talking about a failure on an entirely different level, right, for what Hamas is doing. So if you're just going to make this sort of, pragmatic, kind
comparison.
Comparison, right? You're going to say, that, like, well, I might not love it, but, everything else failed, etc., right? Like, I don't think that's going to get you where you want to go, if where you want to go is this sort of, light endorsement of that, right? That I think some people on parts of the left are prone to, which, I also, again, I think it's just sort of, bad substantively. I am, using the Kevin Bacon rules, right? Degrees of connection, right? I'm, not all that many degrees removed from some people who were, murdered, by Hamas, but also I think it's extremely bad strategically, like, to say this, because it's like, it seems like a gift to apologists for the Israeli state that, it's like, oh yeah, sure, there are all these people objecting to it, but that's just because they're, supporters of Hamas and they love what happened on October 7th. And that seems like a weird gift to give those people.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, the end result of the militant action, congratulations, you killed a bunch of people, killed a bunch of Israelis. But you also have failed to do anything politically about the status of Palestine, secure any kind of better circumstance or independence for the Palestinian people. And you've given Israel a pretext to carry out what's certainly going to be, they've certainly razed Gaza to the ground and they've displaced 80% of the population. We'll see how many of them are allowed back. We'll see if Israel decides to move the goalposts and keep some of the territory they're occupying now. These things were not possible before, but it was this, I would argue, very ill-considered, apart from spectacularly brutal, Hamas action that created the conditions that allow Israel to return into the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. I'd also point out, I saw some stuff going by in the chat about how the U.S. used to consider Nelson Mandela a terrorist, etc. That's true. The question is, what do you conclude from that, right? What I would conclude is that, like, the American state is a very bad judge of these matters, but I'd also say that you can exercise your own judgment, right? In other words, you don't just
say that,
say we just have no idea what's what and who's to say, and you don't have to say, we're going to either agree with or just make whatever the opposite judgments are to the ones the American state made. You can make reasonable differentiations, right? So, for example, without denying that without turning history into a simplistic morality tale and denying that that there were things that the ANC did that you might not love. One thing they most definitely didn't do was just like go from house to house killing random white South Africans, and would not have, right? Because there were lots of it's very small minority of the white population, but there were lots of white South Africans who joined the ANC, and part of the reason they wouldn't have done that is because there was a driving vision of the sort of future for a post-apartheid South African they wanted, that was an ideological vision that that was of a post-racial society, where white South Africans were part of the new society they wanted to build, right? And this goes back to the point about how it is like, look, there are actual opinion polls. You can look at this, and I know some of this kind of controversial methodology, whatever, but there are where Palestinians are actually incredibly divided about what they would ultimately want. After the end of the conflict, there's there's like about 8% that would like a single state with equal rights for everybody. About 12% that would like an equal state without rights for Israeli Jews. Which is bad. Although I'd also point out that there are 29% of Israelis who endorse the equivalent in the same poll, and there are about 33% who want a two-state solution. And by far the most popular option is I have no idea. Right? Is like doesn't express an opinion, which I think is maybe unsurprising, given the way the last few decades have gone. That you have probably the largest single group of the population just doesn't really have hope for any sort of political solution and has no idea.
Not only that, but this is a population that has every reason to mistrust a survey instrument like that. It's like, so you want to know what I think, and you're not going to put this in my file? No response. My response is no response.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But I just to
go back for a second on the terrorist thing, everything Ben said was right. I sum it up by saying that when the American state declares somebody a terrorist, that is a zero information label.
Exactly.
They might be, they might not be. Has nothing to do with that statement.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't give you a good reason to think it's either true or false. That's just like, yes, not
zero information.
Yes, I think that's well put. Okay, let's if we're gonna get through another chunk before we go to the post game, let's watch.
In the middle of the big social protests in his own country, and I couldn't understand what he thought he was doing, except that it seemed to me political expediency, that he had to get power. Again, he had put a bunch of right-wing headbangers into his cabinet who had incredibly bad records, speak in an incredibly incendiary way about Palestinians, for example, and that he did this for power. And then he launched because they were pushing him to do it, a ridiculous assault on the integrity of the Supreme Court, the independence of the Supreme Court. And many Israelis rose up. So Netanyahu has become, to me, a big problem. right? And the people, all the polling shows that Israeli people are very unhappy with Netanyahu. I don't think he's ever going to actually want to forge peace. And in fact, I think he was instrumental with Hamas in wanting to keep them in power because he felt that that would create the split with the Palestinians, with two political groups, and that would be good for Israel.
And it was leaked in a Likud conference in 2019 that he was bragging about giving Hamas money because this is a way that we can keep Palestinians divided. And yet, so we'll never have one. So this is a guy who was.
But look, we can agree about Netanyahu, I think.
No,
right?
but not just Netanyahu. There's a book.
And I would say most of his cabinet.
There's a book called The Fear of Peace. It's by Moshe Zimmerman. And he's an Israeli historian. And he said, like, the average Israeli citizen does not have a vision of peace. Because for 70 years, this is a country that has been, the military, the war has been going on for, they have been expanding because of war, the military is taking over. So the whole idea of peace is not even there. It's not just Netanyahu. Like you have, I remember you have interviewed Naftali Bennett.
Yes.
And I think you tweeted that like that was like a very kind of reasonable take. Yeah,
I don't think I said reasonable. No.
Yeah. But like this Naftali, he went after Queen Rania. And he called up shame on Queen Rania.
No, I didn't say reasonable. I just said this. I did a fire emoji.
Yeah.
I just said what he was saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask you about Queen Rania, and let's ask about since you've raised it, because Queen Rania accused the West of a glaring double standard. She said it's the first time in modern history there's such human suffering, and the world is not even calling for a ceasefire. So the silence is deafening, and to many in our region, it makes the Western world complicit. Now. Other people said, well, okay, if you feel that strongly, why aren't you taking in any Palestinians? Why is Egypt not taking Palestinians? Why does the Arab world want to constantly attack Israel without actually offering any place to go for the Palestinians? And what do you say to that?
That is exactly what Israel wants. And that is exactly what actually starts Third War III. This is the war solution. These are Palestinians. These are their lands. And then suddenly take them. Why? So they're being basically kicked around from their homes. And now another country should take them? You see what will happen? Imagine this. Now. And because Israeli official has been talking openly about this. It's like, why don't they just go in Sinai? Why they go? You know what would happen? Those people are going to be pushed in Sinai. And with any population, 2 million people, they are living in refugee camp. What do you think will happen? Unrest. Chaos. And then after a few years, the Western media will come with their cameras like, oh, look at those Arabs. Oh, they're killing each other. Oh, Israel is good that they got rid of them. And then they will go to the West Bank. And so those 3.5 million people push into Jordan. The whole idea, why does Jordan take them? Why does Egypt take them? The same question. Europe has 44 countries. Why don't they take Israel? America has 50 states. Why don't they give them Florida? I mean, we seem to complain about Florida the whole time. Why don't they just like give Israel? The whole idea was like, oh, you're Arabs, you're all the same. No. Because what will happen then? So Israel will move into Jordan? It's like, oh, Saudi, why don't you take the Jordanian?
So
this is not a solution. This is not a solution.
Bassem, I hear you. I'm not taking a position either way. Let me ask you directly.
But I want to say something about what Queen Rania said.
Okay.
The whole idea about like the West.
Yeah.
I think that in 3 weeks, Israel morally corrupted the West like no other. I think the West will have a lot of time to recover because for years, the West has been telling us, oh, look, we're liberal. We're all about human rights. All are equal. Adopt our values. And then suddenly, you don't want to even to cease. We don't want to even tell Israel to stop. And suddenly we wake up and we found McDonald's are giving free meals to the Israeli because like nothing will make you feel better after killing a bunch of Palestinian kids than a Happy Meal.
So let me ask you this.
They have a toy.
So this brings me to Hamas, okay? So what Israel will say, because they say it to me every time they come on the program, whoever from Ehud Barak to Naftali Bennett, whoever it may be, they say, look, we suffered such a catastrophic terror attack on October the 7th that we have decided we are going to get rid of Hamas. There are 40,000 or so Hamas terrorists in their eyes who need to be got rid of. And I do believe they're terrorists. Only terrorists can commit the kind of act of terrorism we saw. So can we, on that point, can we agree on that? Do you believe Hamas is a terror group?
It is classified by America as I'm not a big fan of Hamas, and they are a militant group, that does like stuff that.
Are they terrorists, do you think?
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. So we agree on this.
Mhm.
So you have 40,000 of them living in Gaza amongst the civilian population. If Israel has decided to eliminate a terror group, Hamas, as the world did with ISIS, for example, and I think there are a lot of parallels given the way they behaved on October the 7th to ISIS. How do you do it? How do you do it if you don't do it the way Israel is currently trying to do it?
Exactly not the way that Israel does it, because if you have one of the most advanced military powers in the world, and it takes you 3 weeks, 9,000 Palestinian civilian death, 21,000 injured. As we are talking right now, Israel just bombed Jabalia, which is a known refugee camp. This it is a very this is not self-defense. You know, like one of the most questions, like, does Israel have the right to defend itself? This is a no value question. This is a no value question.
Well, I would ask a different point. I would say not only do they have a right to defend themselves, which every country would after a terror attack, right? But they actually have a duty and responsibility to their population to try and stop that happening again to them.
They've been doing,
and I do understand, and I agree with that.
Yeah, but here's the thing: if it takes you all of that time, all of these civilians, to take out a few hundred guerrilla fighters,
we don't know how many of the people
who died.
We don't know.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, but Bassem, you don't know, and I don't know.
We don't know, but
right? We don't even know if the casualty numbers are correct because they're all coming from Hamas.
And we should,
health authority,
and we should believe Israel?
No, not necessarily. No, I don't believe either side.
But
worth pointing out here that the IDF actually doesn't even make this claim, although all of Israel's defenders in the West do, that the Gazan health ministry numbers are inaccurate. It's even, and it's generally agreed that their numbers have been accurate in past outbreaks of conflict. Again, Israeli sources themselves don't really dispute this, etc. Like this is something that has, in the last 2 months, people have to tell themselves something, right? So this is what they tell themselves, but the idea that the medical establishment and in Gaza is juicing the numbers is really just based on nothing except for saying, like, well, Hamas is the administration in Gaza, and and these are doctors working in Gaza, therefore essentially they're Hamas numbers. But I mean, be like, nobody's ever presented evidence that the numbers are being juiced, and it really doesn't seem like it.
And I think that that's a much better response than the one that Bassem gives, actually, because he turns around and whatabouts it, right? That you believe the Israeli numbers, you believe the Israelis. And I think that there's a very measured case to be made that the IDF, the Israeli establishment, the Israeli government, and a lot of backers of Israel are spreading disinformation actively.
Right.
But that wouldn't justify if Hamas were juicing the numbers.
Right.
I think that your take is the correct one, right? Let's not lose sight of the fact that these are doctors, therefore highly skilled, in demand, highly educated professionals who could leave if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that hard to emigrate if you have an MD, if you, especially if you learn English or French or German. I mean, look at Bassem Youssef, right? He went from doctor in Egypt, experienced a little bit of political repression, and now he's a media figure and a very successful comedian. You'll find a safe place to go if you want, which means that the doctors that stay in Gaza have a commitment to their community and to the ethics of their profession that you shouldn't casually impugn, because after all, they've voted with their feet. We know what they would do in a life or death situation. They're operating on children that have been bombed. Right. What are you doing, Piers Morgan?
Yeah. I mean, and really like the kind of stories that you see. If always recommend that people read 972 magazine. It's a there are Palestinians who write for it too, but I mean it's a left wing Israeli magazine online. You can find in English, and you know, and there's a lot of on the ground stuff that that comes out in there. You know, you read like really like seriously harrowing stuff in there about people, you know, performing surgery using the flashlights on their phones, you know, because that's the last remaining, you know, source of light in a bombed hospital, you know, things like this. And, you know, just sort of you know, lumping all these people, you know, together with you know, like the doctors and medical authorities in Gaza, you know, together with Hamas, you know, because, well, you know, Gaza is in a certain way, you know, governed by Hamas. Therefore, you know, although God knows they're in less of a position than ever now to actually exercise any meaningful oversight, you know, that like, therefore they could theoretically get them to lie. Therefore, you know, therefore these doctors are lying. I mean, it's like that's the kind of thing that you should like really have some pretty serious evidence before you start, you know, making allegations like that about people who are actually trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation.
And the numbers are going to be off because everyone who's in a position to do the counting hasn't slept in a week,
Right.
is malnourished, probably dehydrated, horribly traumatized, wondering when the next bombs are coming in. And their job, probably on top of other substantive duties, is to count the corpses of dead civilians. So you'll make a few mistakes.
Yeah. No, I'm sure that's true too. The, you know, I mean, the sort of main piece of evidence that I still see people bringing up is the initial overestimate of the first of you know, at this point, like what hospital in Gaza hasn't been bombed, but you know, the first one, you know, Al-Shif, like it was Al-Shif was different, but like the first one that was bombed, the Baptist hospital, that was like in serious dispute for a while, that people say, oh, the number was a horrible overestimate. And because like really just ding the parking lot a little bit. So what are you even talking about? If you actually look at the details there, even the U.S. estimates for the casualties in that hospital aren't too far off from the widely mocked number that was provided by a doctor on the ground at the time. Also, this is not like me or, you know, some like you know, some like bleeding heart leftist source saying this. Nate Silver, I saw on Twitter, posted this article that there's also, it does seem like the sort of initial report there was a translation issue that got that sort of got picked up by the global media about, you know, the use of the word casualties, right? Are we just talking about dead people, or are we talking about dead and, you know, injured people, right? And in that case, we're not even talking about the overall big number, you know, the health, you know, Gazan health ministry overall, you know, overall estimate. So I mean, that's maybe a deeper dive than than this deserves, but I mean, this is you know, this is a talking point you see all the time, and you know, I think it's pretty flimsy. But let's watch just a little bit more before we go to the post game, because we did start late.
But here's my problem with
But here's
Israel.
my point. I don't think we should assume that we know these statistics are correct.
Mhm.
How many children have been killed? We do know a lot have been killed, so the moral argument remains the same. But we don't know how many Hamas terrorists have been killed in the last 3 weeks. We just don't know, do we?
So basically, we're dealing with a very incompetent military force that has been sucking America dry for years, and then they cannot do the job.
But how else do they get rid of Hamas?
Not like that.
How do they do it?
I don't know, but not like that, because they've been trying.
But you've got to have another.
They have. First of all, I'm not a military expert. Second of all, they've been trying the same thing for years. They go in. This is not an eye for an eye anymore. This is an eye, a limb, a life, a house, a neighborhood, a whole population for an eye.
They don't see. I mean, your friend Ben Shapiro, that you particularly despise,
Oh, I love Ben Shapiro. He's
Yeah.
very smart.
Oh, yeah, but you've been very critical of him, and that's fair enough. I'm sure he would be of you. But when I asked him about proportion, he said I don't care about a proportionate response.
So let's kill
Right.
civilians as
Hamas
until
did
we're done.
this, so we are going to get rid
Yeah,
of Hamas.
but he,
It's not in his eyes. It wasn't eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It was this group of terrorists did this, and we are now going to rid the world of these terrorists.
and this is very important to look at things in context. When you see how Israelis talk inside their community, there was a very famous post by Uriel Eritzol. He is the speechwriter of Netanyahu. He said, "What is so horrific about understanding that the whole Palestinians people are our enemies? All of them are enemy combatants. We should kill them, kill their mother, destroy their homes, the homes that they raised those snakes, so no snakes will be raised in this house anymore." And this was reposted by Ali Chaket, which is the minister of, wait for it, justice. It's not about Hamas anymore. It is not about Hamas. They can tell you it's about Hamas, but it's not about. It is basically. They have said it many times, Piers. This is a way to kind of push them into Sinai. This is not about eradicating Hamas. This ship has sailed. I am sorry, but anybody who still believes that this is about Hamas is stupid, because
See, I don't agree with that.
really.
No, because I think.
But why they're?
I tell you, I don't agree.
There are like 100 people.
I think
killed in
any
Gaza
country,
and
any
West Bank.
country that suffered the kind of terror attack that Israel suffered, with the kind of death toll that occurred that day, 1,500 plus people, grandmothers, kids, young women being raped, kidnapped, beheaded, it's been reported, and so on. Well, you can raise an eyebrow. I mean, they found a young woman's skull, right? Somehow,
What about the babies that were beheaded?
Well, there was a report, and you and I had this discussion on air. You falsely quoted me, and I wanted to clarify that with you in person. You thought I'd said that 40 babies had been beheaded.
So what did you say?
I never said that.
What did you say?
I said it's been reported that 40 babies were killed, some of whom had been beheaded. That's what I said.
Yeah. Totally,
So
totally different. Yeah.
There's a very different. Well, it is different.
Yes.
You accept it?
English as a second language, so
they're different things.
Of course, yes.
Between saying 40 babies have been beheaded and 40 babies have been reported to have been killed, including
So where
some
are those
who were
beheaded babies?
Well, apparently journalists are being shown utterly horrific
Okay,
footage.
this comes to a very important question about credibility. Again, I'm not condoning what happened on October 7th, but I'm not a journalist. But as a journalist, wouldn't you take anything that an authority would say with a grain of salt?
Yes.
Especially if this authority have a long history of lying. And I'm just going to give a few examples. 1996, they bombed Kana. It's a refugee camp. They killed 106 people. And despite that they knew it's a refugee camp. They said, oh, maybe it's a one-time off. 2006, they bombed Kana again. 2014, they killed 2 teenagers at a checkpoint. They denied, as usual, but CNN was there. So they said, we have to say it. 2018, they killed a medic, a Palestinian medic, and they fabricated a video showing that it's someone else, that he was a human shield. And then can I just finish?
Yeah, but I do want to respond.
And then 2010, they killed Ahmed Oraiqat, denied it, then said, it's okay, it's us. 2021, they bombed the media office in Hamas. It's not us, but no, I'm sorry. And then 11th May 2022, Shireen Abu Akleh, a reporter, your colleague, she's Palestinian, American citizen, she was shot in the head. And they provided forensic evidence and even a doctor's video that it was not them, it was Islamic Jihad. How can I expect to believe this regime, especially if the president of Israel comes down with this ridiculous thing? Have you seen him there? No. He said, okay. This was reported by Sky News, and it was the funniest thing I've seen so much. This was a Colin Powell moment, but like the cheap edition. Mr. Herzog said, like Isaac Herzog, it's like, we have found evidence on one of the terrorists, a manual to create chemical bombs. And then he showed this, and he showed, and this is, I just want to say, why would a foot soldier go into enemy with like a manual to chemical bombing? It's like, is that BYOB, bring your own beer, bomb? It's crazy. And what he like have like local ingredients to make, and then this is like, this is a manual of Al-Qaeda, of course, conveniently written Qaeda. And let me read it to you in Arabic because this is funny. So, النشرة الدولية المعنية بالتطوير الذاتي والمعرفي للمجاهدين, which basically say, this is basically like a catalog for self-improvement for mujahideen. I didn't know that they have life coaches. So this, and you know what Sky News said? It's like, we cannot confirm or any of this, but we will show it anyways.
So let
And
me
they wrote
respond.
answer.
Let me
So
respond.
this is like
Let me respond.
this is a lying government.
So let me respond. I
Yes.
do think the Israeli government has lied,
All the time.
right? I do think they've lied. I'm not going to dispute that. I do think they've been caught lying. I do think they've said things that turned out not to be true. I also think that 2 weeks ago, a hospital was bombed,
Yes.
and it was
Who do you think
immediately.
did it?
Well, I'm going to tell you what I think.
Mhm.
Hamas immediately tell the world it was an Israeli airstrike and that 500 people were killed and that the hospital had been destroyed. And then as the next couple of days go by, the hospital is relatively undamaged. The car park was obliterated. Many fewer people than 500 were killed.
How many people died?
We don't know, because actually we're reliant on the Palestinian Health Authority, which is Hamas in Gaza, for the figures. So we don't know the number, but a lot fewer people died, it would appear, than the
Like
500.
100?
We don't know.
50?
Either way, it's appalling, but it may not have been anywhere near as appalling as was first said by Hamas. But here's the point. Most independent studies of what happened have concluded that it was almost certainly a militant stroke terror group inside Gaza, and they fired a rocket which landed in the hospital car park. In other words, it wasn't an Israeli airstrike.
So I have an issue with that, because for 3 days before the attack, the priest and the patriarch of the hospital, because it's called the Baptist hospital, said that they have received multiple warning from Israel that they're going to hit the hospital. And then at the time of the hit of the hospital, one of the top aides of Netanyahu, he tweeted about like, we hit the hospital, and then he deleted it, and then basically like Israel gaslighted the world.
But
It was not us. It was not us.
but that's why I said most independent.
No, that's not true. New York Times actually like just published something to prove that it was shot from Israel. And the thing is,
No,
okay,
they didn't. Though.
Okay, numbers.
They didn't.
Numbers.
Bassem, that's not true.
Okay.
The New York Times.
Okay. First of all, first point about this, I have no idea what hit the Baptist hospital, and I don't want anything I say to make it sound like I do, because I think this is like a genuine fog of war thing, and I think it'd be silly to try to make definitive judgments about this, at least based on the information I've seen. I don't think it's relevant in terms of the case for a ceasefire, because I think having like missiles flying back and forth around a densely populated area is very bad, and that sort of point kind of applies either way. But Piers is just wrong here. I know exactly what Bassem is talking about, because I saw the same report in the New York Times that they said they'd had they'd like, there was a, you know, they didn't say, to be fair, the New York Times didn't say definitively this was an Israeli airstrike. What they said is there's this video that's been going around that's like one of the key pieces of evidence that it was a failed Islamic Jihad rocket, but we did an analysis of the video, and it really doesn't look like that to us. That like it looks like it was coming, you know, it looks like it was coming from Israel rather than vice versa. Now, is that definitive? You know, there's like a lot of, you know, he said, she said about this. It's kind of bizarre. I'm not sure when this interview was recorded, pretty recently, right? Because but it's kind of bizarre that we're still talking about it, since at this point there are like 100 hospitals that nobody doubts that Israel bombed. But you know, but like he is also just like it is weird to see Piers denying that the New York Times actually cast some doubt on this.
And I think that it speaks very ill of the condition of our public discourse that you end up treating the mainstream media's reporting of factual events a little like the American security apparatus assigning the label of terrorist, right? Like, if the New York Times reports something, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. And for there to be any kind of public engagement in politics or public education at all, you need to have some level of trust in major media sources to at least give the factually correct information.
Right.
Ultimately, what needs to happen is when there is reporting like this, you have to look at how they arrived at their claims. And if it's WMDs in Iraq, because all of the sourcing comes from the State Department, that's very different than when there's a video that you can watch journalists analyze.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that that this is something that and feels almost quaint to talk about this now, because like it's sort of something that everybody has moved on from on all sides. But this is why during the like 5-year period where all anybody wanted to talk about was Russiagate, this used to drive me crazy, because I think if I it's not like I have some view of like mainstream media organs like they're just like constantly confabulating major pieces of evidence or anything like that. I actually don't think that's true. But but when you read a report of the newspaper and the report says anonymous officials at this or that intelligence agency claim that this is true, like that always struck me as something that should have like zero evidential value, right? Like that's like
rather than being treated as the gold standard.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's like, well, wow, all right, anonymous intelligence officials, I guess.
Some guy who won't even give you his name told you something and offered nothing to back it up. Yeah, let's make that the headline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. We've got about a little over half an hour. I think we've got about 34 minutes left, it looks like. So we are going to take that to the post game. If you're a patron, you should already have a email with a link to that. Or if you, for some reason you don't, go to the Patreon and you'll see it there. If you're not, there is no time like the present to do that. End your year by making correct life choices. But in any case, if you are not, then last stream I'm going to be doing of 2023 is on Sunday, and I'll see you there. If you are a patron, Kuba and I will see you in about 2 to 3 minutes. Left is best.